Shut 'em up now. They are so loud. I was happily living with my husband and my sweet mother-in-law, but things changed after our daughter was born. Our daughter cried at night, and I started getting yelled at and treated coldly. One day, while my husband was swamped with work at home, our suddenly crying daughter went silent. In just the brief moment, I looked away. But she wasn't just sleeping. She woke up convulsing. After taking her to the emergency room and hearing the doctor's diagnosis, I decided to get a divorce. My name is Michelle Stevens. I'm a 28-year-old stay-at-home mom. I live with my husband, John, our daughter, Emily, and my mother-in-law, making it a family of 4. I met John 6 years ago at my former job. We were hired at the same time and worked in the same department. From the beginning, I was impressed with his innovative ideas, which didn't seem like they came from someone who started at the same time as me. I was curious about what kind of person he was. He was different from our colleagues. He seemed a bit odd and kept to himself. But when I approached him, I realized he was an interesting guy, though a bit unique. For example, because he loves his job and constantly thinks of new ideas, he has a routine meal plan to avoid deciding what to eat for lunch. It's like Monday is curry, Tuesday is ramen, Wednesday is grilled fish, and so on. So it wasn't that he didn't like spending time with colleagues, but he ate alone to stick to his routine. All I had to do was adjust my lunch schedule to his, and spending time with him became easy. Though we often talked about work when we were together, I learned a lot, and I enjoyed our conversations. He had some other quirks because he's so dedicated to his job, but I found them endearing. I was the one who confessed my feelings and said, "Let's date." He laughed and replied, "I was gonna ask you out soon." Our relationship didn't change much after we started dating. We didn't go on typical romantic dates. Instead, we often ate lunch together and discussed our work projects. However, for the first time since we began dating, he introduced me to his mother. He didn't like spending time on household chores because it took away from his work, so he lived with his mother. From what I heard, his family background was complicated. His parents divorced when he was 10. John stayed with his mother, and his younger sister, who was just a baby, went with their father. He hadn't had any contact with his father or sister since then. I was bracing myself for a very protective mother, but when I met her, she was a wonderful person. Unlike the reserved John, she was talkative and cheerful. She treated me just as warmly as she did her son. Sometimes when John was too busy with work, she and I would go out together. I got along really well with both John and his mother. 3 years into our relationship, after John proposed, his mother jokingly said, "If John's getting married, I guess I should move out." To which I eagerly replied, "I'd be upset if you did. Living with you is one of the reasons I said yes to the proposal. If you're okay with it, please stay with us." She laughed and said, "Are you sure about that? I might be hard on you." I laughed it off, saying, "Bring it on." John, watching us, laughed too. For the next 2 years, we lived together without any problems. She took care of all the household chores for John and me, who were both working. Even when I offered to help, she would say, "You must be tired, let me handle it," and she'd do everything herself. Occasionally on weekends when John was busy working from home, she and I would cook or bake together, which was always fun. John remained dedicated to his job even after we got married. I believe our home was cheerful thanks to his mother, and I was grateful for that. Things started to change when I discovered I was pregnant. 2 years into our marriage, I felt unwell, and at the advice of John's mother, I went to a doctor who confirmed my pregnancy. John was thrilled when I told him, but his mother's reaction was lukewarm. Considering how she always rejoiced in our happy moments more than we did, I sensed something was amiss. That night, in our bedroom, I asked John about it. He explained, Mom, she had postpartum depression after my sister was born. Dad was working in a different city at the time, so she had to take care of both of us by herself. It must have been tough. One day, she left the house with just me. I haven't seen my sister or dad since then. I regretted being so thoughtless and hurting her feelings. I didn't know there was such a backstory. If I had known, I would have told John first and thought more about how to break the news to her. Seeing my disappointment, John smiled and said, "It's been almost 20 years since then. She'll be fine. Just as my husband said, my mother-in-law didn't change a bit from the next day onward. If anything, she became even more concerned about my health, preparing meals with even more attention to ensure I was getting all the necessary nutrients, and accompanying me to the hospital in my husband's place, among many other things. Feeling reassured by her, I decided to give birth here instead of going back to my parents' house. Initially, I had thought about having the baby at my parents' house, but it was in the countryside and quite far away, so the idea of looking for a hospital there and preparing to go back seemed like too much of a hassle. Luckily, my mother-in-law said, "I'll help you out," and I was able to give birth safely. I think I will never forget the moment my daughter Emily was born. She had already been precious to me while in my belly, but the moment I saw her face for the first time, I felt an overwhelming surge of affection and could unconditionally vow to protect her no matter what and make her happy. Both my husband and my mother-in-law were happy about Emily's birth, and I think that was the happiest time of my life. However, that happiness gradually started to crumble. After bringing Emily home from the hospital, I took a year-long maternity leave, thinking that I would help with childcare and household chores. But my mother-in-law said, "I've always taken care of the house, and that's not going to change. You don't need to worry about it." True to her word, she took care of various things around the house, as she always did, but she wouldn't get involved with Emily. I even felt an atmosphere as if she was deliberately avoiding her. My mother-in-law, who always listened attentively to what I had to say, would give vague responses or pretend not to hear when the topic of Emily came up. I was saddened by my mother-in-law's behavior, which seemed like she was ignoring my daughter, but I couldn't speak up strongly because I knew about her past. Even after 6 months since Emily was born, my mother-in-law remained the same. By this time, Emily could perfectly distinguish between people's faces, recognizing her father, who didn't have much time to interact with her due to work, and would smile at him. My husband still prioritized work, but when he had the time, he would talk to Emily and try to communicate with her, so he was delighted that she started smiling at him. Around that time, Emily started having episodes of night crying. I haven't seen many other children, so I'm not sure, but I think Emily's night crying was on the severe side. She would cry non-stop for 2 to 3 hours in the middle of the night, quite frequently. I felt sorry for my husband and my mother-in-law waking up because of it, so I tried to soothe Emily in the living room or the bathroom, as far away from the bedroom as possible. However, since our house was not that big, they could still hear her. The number of times my husband and my mother-in-law mentioned that it was loud last night had increased. Although my husband is one thing, my mother-in-law usually never complained about anything, so I think this was probably the first complaint she ever made to me. I tried my best to soothe Emily, but her night crying didn't stop. Gradually, my husband and my mother-in-law seemed to become more irritable, and their way of speaking became more and more rough, saying things like, "It's so noisy," and "make her stop crying." At the end of that year, there was an important planning meeting at my husband's company. Whether his project idea would be accepted at this meeting would determine if he would be entrusted with a project in the next fiscal year. In the next fiscal year, it was that kind of meeting. Knowing how important this meeting was, I had planned to go back to my parents' house for 2 nights and 3 days, starting 2 days before the meeting, so that my husband's work wouldn't be disrupted by Emily's night crying. I was being considerate in my own way. However, things didn't go as planned. In fact, I ended up going back to my parents' house even sooner. It was the weekend, less than a week before my husband's presentation, and he was working on his proposal at home. I had planned to go out so as not to disturb him, but it was raining heavily that day. Since I didn't have a driver's license, I hesitated to go out with Emily. If we went out in the heavy rain of December, Emily would surely catch a cold. Reluctantly, I stayed at home, paying extra attention to not let Emily cry. However, she suddenly started crying. She had just had her milk, and her diaper was clean. I was playing with her while holding her, and I didn't understand why she started crying. Trying to keep the crying sound from reaching my husband as much as possible, I moved with Emily to the bathroom, the furthest place from the bedroom where my husband was working, and tried desperately to soothe her. But Emily wouldn't stop crying. Then my husband opened the door of the bedroom and shouted, "It's too noisy. Make her stop crying now." This way of speaking was unthinkable from the husband I knew when we first got married, but this was pretty much what he had been like recently. I understand that work is important, but I thought he didn't have to speak in such a manner. I was so careful, and yet Emily started crying and I got yelled at by my husband. I felt like crying myself, thinking, but I thought that once my husband gets a break from work, things would go back to normal. And my daughter Emily, she'll stop crying someday, right? So I tried desperately to hold back my tears. I had just fed her, thinking that I needed to do something. But then I decided to give Emily another bottle of milk. I thought maybe if she's full, she might just fall asleep. Unfortunately, since I physically can't produce breast milk, I had no choice but to boil water and prepare formula. I couldn't just leave Emily in the bathroom while I made it, so I brought her to the living room and laid her down in the crib. My mother-in-law, who was there in the living room, frowned as Emily continued to cry and said, "Hey, when is she gonna stop crying? John can't concentrate on his work, and I can't stand this noise anymore." Recently, my husband John and my mother-in-law have been acting like this. She helps with housework and talks to me, but when it comes to Emily, she doesn't touch her, and if she does, she just complains. That's how my mother-in-law has been lately. I apologized to my mother-in-law and asked her to watch Emily for a bit. I went to the kitchen and quickly prepared the milk. Even then, I could hear Emily's piercing cries. But by the time the water had cooled down and the milk was ready, the crying had suddenly stopped. I knew it. My mother-in-law had gotten Emily to stop crying. I was touched. When I returned to the living room, just as I thought, Emily was asleep. My mother-in-law was sitting on the sofa reading a book. When I thanked her, saying, "You're really something else." "There's nothing like the touch of someone who has raised kids before," she responded, I suppose. But she seemed somewhat brusque. I felt a slight discomfort with her response, but I was relieved that we weren't disturbing John, so I didn't pay it much mind. However, Emily did not wake up even after about 3 hours. If this continues, she won't be able to sleep at night and might start crying again. That's what I thought, so I decided to wake her up. But even when I called to her, Emily wouldn't open her eyes. When I tapped her lightly on the shoulder, she opened her eyes, but she seemed dazed, and her eyes weren't focusing properly. She was acting differently from when she is usually groggy after a nap. I became worried and consulted my mother-in-law, telling her that something seemed off with Emily. But without even looking at her, she said, "It's probably just your imagination. She'll be fine." I believed my mother-in-law's words and waited for a while, but Emily's eyes never focused. Scared, I went to my husband John, who was working in the bedroom. "I know you're busy, but can you take out the car? Something's wrong with Emily. She seems completely out of it. It's strange. I'm worried. I want to take her to the hospital, please." I pleaded desperately, but John, seemingly annoyed, said, "Are you sure it's not just your imagination?" "What does my mom say?" "Your mom says she's fine, but she's clearly not okay to me." If Mom says she's fine, then she must be okay. I need to finish this today. Don't bother me, but I'm really worried. When I said this, John raised his voice. "Give me a break. Can't you see I'm working? I thought she finally stopped crying, and now you want to go to the hospital? Don't be ridiculous." I was so stunned by my husband's outburst that I couldn't say anything. Then, turning back to his computer, John muttered, "I never wanted a kid in the first place." His words still ring in my ears to this day. I couldn't believe my ears. It was unthinkable for John to say something like that. But I definitely saw him say it. I couldn't stop crying from the shock. I never thought John would say something like that. I left the bedroom, still crying, but when I saw Emily, my tears dried up. She was having convulsions. I thought something was wrong. Just a moment ago, Emily seemed perfectly fine. She didn't look ill at all. Panicking, I called a taxi and rushed to the emergency room. I couldn't stop trembling at the thought of something happening to Emily. When we arrived at the hospital, a pediatrician saw us right away. There's a possibility of shaken baby syndrome, he said, and decided to do a CT scan on Emily. I didn't know about the disease, so I frantically looked it up while I was in the waiting room. Shaken baby syndrome is apparently a condition where a baby, whose neck muscles are still undeveloped, suffers brain damage due to being violently shaken. I learned that in severe cases, it could lead to death, which made my blood run cold. For a while, I was stunned and couldn't think about anything else. I don't know how much time had passed, but I was called in because the doctor wanted to discuss the results of the examination. Fortunately, Emily doesn't have any hematoma, and she's calmed down now since we've given her an anticonvulsant. The doctor said, bringing me relief. However, the doctor then said something unbelievable. But, when the nurse was undressing Emily for the examination, she found marks on her neck and shoulders that looked like they were made by an adult's fingers. I didn't understand what he was implying. Shaken baby syndrome is a condition that occurs when a baby is shaken vigorously. It can happen while trying to comfort them or during play when they're being tossed in the air and things unfortunately go wrong. We were thinking that might be the cause, but looking at those marks, it's also possible someone intentionally shook her quite hard. The doctor continued in a matter-of-fact tone. If you don't remember anything, it could have been another family member. We were able to treat her in time this round, and there was no hematoma, so she's fine. But if the same thing happens again, we can't guarantee Emily will be safe. I think you should have a serious talk with your family. I couldn't get the doctor's words out of my head, even after I left the examination room. I have never abused my daughter, and I've never seen any signs of abuse on her. There were no marks on her when I changed her diaper and dressed her earlier today. I could only think that my mother-in-law must have done something while I was making Emily's milk. Emily would need to stay in the hospital for about 3 days just to be safe. So I decided to go home to get the things we needed. Did you do something to Emily? I asked my mother-in-law in a trembling voice when I got back home. Then my mother-in-law responded, "What?" I didn't do anything, in a clearly suspicious manner. Usually she would ask, "What do you mean? What happened? Did something happen?" But this time she just denied it without asking anything. "Tell me the truth." As I yelled and confronted her, she finally admitted it. I just grabbed and shook her a little because she was being too noisy. A little? The doctor said there were severe marks on her neck and shoulders. Because of what you did, Emily was in serious danger. When I said that, my mother-in-law responded nonchalantly, "Danger? But she's fine now, right? So what's the big deal?" I raised my voice, and at that moment, my husband came out of the bedroom. "Shut up, both of you. Keep it down," he said, before slamming the door shut with a loud bang. I had sent him a message earlier, telling him that Emily was having seizures and we were going to the hospital, but he didn't ask about her condition and just complained about the noise. My husband, who did not seem remorseful at all for putting our daughter in danger, and my mother-in-law, who was unapologetic and casual about the whole situation. I had thought we had a good relationship, but it turned out I was wrong. That moment was when I lost all affection for them and gave up on this family. And then I hurriedly grabbed the bags for the hospital stay and my own belongings and left the house. Luckily, I had planned to return to my parents' house, so I had travel luggage ready, and I grabbed that. In the taxi heading to the hospital where my daughter Emily was, I made up my mind to get a divorce. Some might think this is an overreaction, but for me, it was a big deal. Of course, I was furious at my mother-in-law's actions, but the main cause was my husband's behavior. I do think my husband's job is tough. The upcoming planning meeting, whether he gets selected or not, would change how fulfilling his work is for the next fiscal year. But that's not the kind of job you continue doing, neglecting the fact that your daughter has to go to the ER and is hospitalized. It's not a life-threatening job, nor is it a job that only he can do. It's about whether he becomes the project leader or the assistant. Yet, I was fed up with my husband, who is the only father Emily has, for not coming to us, let alone asking about her condition. 3 days after the admission, Emily was safely discharged from the hospital. Intending to divorce my husband, I did not return home, but went to my parents' house. My husband and mother-in-law were supposed to visit my parents' house from that day, so they probably didn't think anything of it when I didn't show up. Back at my parents' house, I told them what had happened. My mom hugged Emily and me, crying, and after my dad angrily slammed his fist on the desk, he said, "You need to leave him." He said, "You don't have to go back there. Stay here with us. I'll protect you and Emily." I broke down in tears at his words. After that, my parents and I started looking into divorce. With our layman's research, all we could understand was that divorce seemed difficult. My mother-in-law's actions weren't continuous, so it couldn't be considered abuse. If the other party contested the divorce, it seemed like it would be difficult even if it went to mediation. So I decided to play hardball. On the third day at my parents' house, I received a message from my husband John saying, "The presentation went well, so come back home. Let's celebrate its success." Irritated by his carefree attitude, I decided to go back home once to talk about divorce. I didn't want Emily to see John or my mother-in-law ever again, so I asked my mom to keep her at my parents' house. When I got home, John, surprised that I came back alone, finally asked, "Where's Emily? Is she still in the hospital? Is she that sick?" "Emily has been discharged. She's at my parents' house now. Why didn't you bring her back with you?" "I want a divorce." Both John and my mother-in-law were stunned. "What? Emily was safe this time. But what if you had shaken her more violently? If I hadn't noticed and left it be, Emily might not have made it. Thinking about it, I'm scared of you, Anne." I tried to continue pointing out John's issues when he interrupted me. "If you are scared of my mom, we can live separately. So please reconsider the divorce." At his words, my mother-in-law confronted him, saying, "What? You'd choose Emily over me?" Ignoring her, John said to me, "See? Isn't that okay?" I continued what I was saying earlier. "No, I am disappointed in you, John. I can't believe you said I never wanted kids. And I'm disappointed that you prioritized your job over our daughter's life. Whether we live separately from your mom or not, I can only think of divorce." When I said that, John grabbed my hand. "No way. I was out of my mind back then because of work. I love you and Emily. I apologize, so please don't talk about divorce. I think words and actions under pressure reveal true feelings, so I can't trust you anymore. I won't divorce you, even if it comes to mediation." His words made my heart race. This would be bad for me if it went to mediation. It would be difficult to accuse his mother of abuse and use it as a reason for divorce, as I had researched at my parents' house. So I decided to tell them a lie that I had thought of at that moment. "I don't mind if it goes to mediation, but if it does, your mother might get arrested for abuse. Just be prepared for that." "What do you mean by abuse?" His mother, who approached me with a frightening face, had no resemblance to the mother-in-law I used to like. I was suspected of abuse at the hospital. I told them I didn't do it, and I got a medical certificate. The marks on Emily's neck were also photographed. If I can prove that these hands belong to your mother, the abuse will be proven. If John insists on going through divorce mediation, I will submit the medical certificate and photos. In reality, this method had almost no effect. Even if it could be proven, it might not be considered abuse if they realized it was just a one-time incident. However, they seemed to believe it. That would be a problem. Please think it over again. I have no intention of reconsidering. Besides, if you're going to file for mediation, I will comply, but I will make sure the dates are on weekdays. Can you prioritize us over your important work?" John flinched when I said this. His mother was constantly begging him, "Hey, John, please divorce her. I'm gonna get caught." For a while, John was silent, deep in thought. I added, "I will use any means necessary to divorce you." After thinking for a while longer, John reluctantly agreed to the divorce. Throughout the discussions about property division and child support, John repeatedly asked, "You're kidding, right? And can't you reconsider?" But I ignored all of it. In the end, we agreed to divide the assets in half and set the child support at $400 per month. My husband was reluctant to agree to the divorce until the very end, but it seemed like he finally realized my stance wasn't going to change, so he reluctantly agreed. I told him, "Feel free to dispose of all my belongings," and then I left the house. I had no intention of taking anything from that house with me. We had furniture at my parents' house, and I didn't want to remember anything about this house. As I left through the front door, I could hear John and his mother arguing. "It's all your fault, Mom. John, you said you didn't want Emily either, right? This is what you get." "What did you say?" "I covered for you so you wouldn't get caught. If you hadn't done that, we wouldn't have had to go to the hospital, and I wouldn't have had to hear all this." "It's all your fault. I don't want Michelle to leave. I want you to leave." Later, I heard through the grapevine that John and his mother had divorced. Separated. Apparently, John and his mother had been fighting non-stop since the incident. They were blaming each other for the divorce. Since the apartment was in John's name, his mother was kicked out and is now working in a cleaning job, being bossed around by people more than 20 years her junior. It's been a year since then, and Emily is growing up safely without any lingering effects. She's starting to learn words, calling me Mom, and even saying Grandpa and Grandma. She's getting better at many things every day. My mother is looking after her, allowing me to rejoin the workforce at a local company. With my previous experience, I was placed in the planning department, but unlike John, I prioritize my family over work. I've heard about John's situation through former colleagues. Apparently, he struggled with living alone, couldn't concentrate on his work, and the project he proposed started to fail. Eventually, John was removed as project leader and was transferred from the planning department to human resources. It's quite an ironic story. My husband, who was so devoted, got taken off the planning department, and I, who have been prioritizing our family, got assigned to it. Moreover, my work is going really well. When I brainstorm with my daughter on my lap, a ton of great ideas come to me, and I'm able to write excellent project proposals. Not just in terms of work, my personal life has also been flourishing recently. There's this single father from my workplace, and things are going pretty well between us. We first hit it off talking about our kids and have become good friends since. On weekends, we take our kids to parks or amusement parks. His 3-year-old son has taken a liking to me, and he plays with my daughter too. He's also kind to my daughter, so I want to keep seeing him. I've just gotten divorced, so I'm not about remarrying right away, but if things continue to go well, I hope someday I might become his wife. How could this happen in just 5 days? I screamed as I looked around the living room of my house. I had been admitted to the hospital to give birth, and in the 5 days until my discharge, the living room had become filled with the smell of rotting food. Unfinished frozen food was left on the desk, along with remnants of leftovers scattered across the floor. Surrounding them, I could see lots of flies. Cleaning and tidying up is your job, right? I asked my husband, waving my hand irritably at the small insects flying around the light. He turned around and frowned upon seeing me, covering his nose from the stench. "See, it's impossible to live in such a stinky room, isn't it? Hurry up and clean it." I was at a loss for words. Could my husband not see the baby in my arms? My name is Madison, a 28-year-old office worker. I've been working at the company I joined right after graduation, blessed with respectable supervisors and colleagues, and everything's been going well. A few years ago, I married Ethan, who I met at the same company and is 2 years older than me. After we got married, I continued working, and Ethan and I were good colleagues at the company. After work, we were great partners, supporting and encouraging each other through our troubles. When we were about a year into our marriage, I found out I was pregnant. We were delighted since we wanted a child. Our parents and in-laws cried tears of joy when we told them. My in-laws have been kind to me since Ethan and I started dating. When I first went to their house to greet them before we got married, they welcomed me with open arms. After getting married, since our homes are close, Ethan's mother and I often go out on weekends, and we've built a good relationship. When I told Ethan, "Your parents are truly considerate and wonderful," he nodded and said, "Mom's been an amazing mother who's looked after me." Dad worked from dawn till dusk and wasn't home much, but he always showered us with love and gratitude towards Mom, which made me realize once again what a caring couple they are. After we got married, my mother-in-law would often express concern, saying, "Values have changed over the years, and as long as you and Ethan are happy with your lives, that's all that matters. But I worry that you Madison will be burdened with all the housework now that you're married and working. I reassured her with a smile, saying no need to worry. Ethan and I are splitting the chores well and helping each other out, and she seemed relieved. Actually, Ethan and I began living together after we got married. My mother-in-law knew this and was probably concerned about whether we could live together without any discontent. Of course, there were some worries about getting married without having lived together first. But Ethan was always kind to me during our dating period, never forgetting to be considerate even after many years. So I was confident that we could live together without any problems. True to my expectations, Ethan had been sticking to the promises we made since we started living together, and he never pushed all the responsibilities onto me. He even said he wanted to lessen my burdens more. Such a caring husband, after finding out about my pregnancy, told me to rely on him more when we were together, since something might happen to our precious child. Despite his busy schedule, Ethan managed to take care of the household. In the early stages of my pregnancy, I suffered from morning sickness and often had to take time off work. I used to blame myself, having always managed to balance work and everything else before. Even when I saw Ethan going to work every day and felt that I should at least do some housework, I couldn't because I was feeling ill. When I cried and apologized to Ethan, saying I'm sorry I couldn't do anything today, he reassured me, hey, no need to apologize. I've lived alone for a long time, so household chores are no big deal. Madison, you're doing your best to nurture our baby in your belly. I can't completely understand your hardship, so let me at least take care of our home. Lately, Ethan has been very studious, buying parenting books and diligently studying every day. Seeing him like this made me realize again how glad I am to have married him. My pregnancy went smoothly and I spent it without any worries until the birth. My parents and in-laws would come by from time to time to check on us, and thanks to the support of those around us, the baby grew well in my belly. As the due date approached and my belly grew, I took maternity leave, and now focus on staying healthy and calm. It's tough to go out with my belly so big, but I managed to make it to my prenatal checkups while taking care of myself. Recently, as I've entered the final month, my mother-in-law, who lives nearby, started accompanying me to the checkups because she's worried about me. She helps carry my backpack and other items, and while I feel a bit guilty, I'm also very grateful. At first, I felt guilty for having her come all the way with me and declined when my mother-in-law offered to accompany me. But she cheerfully said, now that my children are grown up, I have quite a bit of free time. Besides, attending your checkups is pretty much all I have to do. I'm certainly concerned about your health, but it also doubles as exercise for me, so it's a win-win situation. So I began to rely on her, and together we headed for the checkup that day. Then, one day, while I was getting my usual checkup at the hospital, I was suddenly struck by a pain in my stomach. The doctor, noticing something was wrong with me, calmly said while trying to reassure me, I'll perform an internal examination right away. While I was nervously waiting for the results, the doctor said, you're showing signs of labor, so you'll be admitted right away. We'll prepare for the delivery while monitoring you closely. You're going to meet your baby soon, he told me gently. However, it was all so sudden that I was not mentally prepared. In the midst of this, my mother-in-law held my hand and reassured me, it's going to be all right. I'll be right here with you, so don't worry. I reminded myself that I had to stay calm for my baby, and gradually I came to accept the situation and prepared myself for the imminent birth. I had calmed down a bit when my mother-in-law said, I'm gonna run home real quick to grab what you need. I'll be right back. I'll also give Ethan a call, and she dashed out of the hospital. A few minutes later, my mother-in-law came back and immediately asked me, are you okay? Are you in any pain or discomfort? Thank you so much. You've been a great help. She held my hand and said with a smile, it's nothing. Just let me do this much. Ethan might be able to get off work early. He could still make it in time for the birth. I've already called your parents, just in case. Her words reminded me that I had completely forgotten to inform my parents about the labor pain and my anxiety about giving birth. My parents, living in the next town over, which I'll equate to living in the next state over, might not make it, before the birth, but they said they would come right away. Soon after, my father-in-law arrived, simply saying, "Oh, it's time," and watched over me from the corridor. Then a while later, my parents arrived. While enduring the repeated labor pains, I waited for the moment to come. My parents deeply thanked my in-laws. "Thank you so much for everything, from getting things ready for the hospital stay to being by our daughter's side." And to me they said, "It'll be over soon. Take some deep breaths. We're all here with you. You'll be okay." My in-laws replied with a smile to my parents, "Oh, no worries at all. We're just glad we made it in time," and the whole family, except for my husband, surrounded me. I was growing more anxious as the intervals between the pains shortened, but having my whole family there was a great comfort. Several hours later, even though it was late into the night, I gave birth to a healthy baby. While waiting in the lounge near the nurse's station, trying not to disturb the other pregnant women and mothers, my in-laws and parents expressed their joy through silent hugs and high fives. Having finally given birth, I was overwhelmed with relief and moved by the sight of my newborn, though I felt a pang of disappointment that my husband was not by my side. He was supposed to have left work early, and I wondered why he hadn't come, but by the next morning, he still hadn't appeared. My in-laws called my husband numerous times, worrying that something had happened, but they couldn't reach him. Even at 9 a.m., my father-in-law went to our house, but my husband did not answer. Finally, when my mother-in-law contacted my husband's office, they were aware that I had been admitted for childbirth and said my husband had left work earlier than usual. It was supposed to be a day dedicated just to me, so he took the day off, and it seems like he didn't show up at the office. After that, the whole family was in a frenzy. If I'm not at home or the office, we thought maybe it was best to go to the police, and it was starting to turn into a big deal. However, just as it was about to be noon, the receptionist informed us that my husband had arrived. Relief was short-lived, and I couldn't help but feel anxious, wondering what on earth had happened. But as I was about to speak to my husband, who had come to the hospital room, I was at a loss for words. "Ah, so it's born," it was all he said at first. His suit was disheveled and his hair was a mess. As he got closer, I could even smell alcohol on him. I couldn't believe he might have gone drinking at a time like this. And when I looked at him, he showed no interest in our baby, instead staring intently at his smartphone. Trying to remain calm, I asked, "What have you been doing up until now?" Ethan, still half asleep, responded, "Sorry, I just went for a drink." It was an old friend I haven't seen in a while, and I couldn't say no. "I've just been sleeping until now and got here late." He didn't take his eyes off his phone during this time, so my anger finally exploded. But before that, my father-in-law grabbed my husband's shoulders and asked, "What are you thinking? It doesn't matter if it's been a while or whatever. Meeting friends for drinks doesn't even compare to your wife giving birth. Why didn't you turn them down?" My husband kept interrupting with, "But," and it's just that. Eventually, he stopped talking altogether with a sullen face under the fiery glare of my father-in-law. After a heavy sigh, he left the hospital room without another glance at me or our baby. My father and father-in-law tried to follow him, but they couldn't keep up due to their age, and my husband never showed his face at the hospital during my stay. 5 days after giving birth, with the support of my family, both mother and child were healthy, and we were discharged without any issues. As my mother and father, who had come from far away, were leaving, my mother-in-law said to them, "We're looking forward to seeing you again. Please leave your daughter to us." On the day of discharge, she helped me get home with my father-in-law carrying the luggage. That morning, after being discharged, I texted my husband just to say I was going home, and he immediately called back. When I answered, he said, "Hey, Madison, I'm glad you're discharged safely. I'm gonna pick you up and we'll head home by car." I hadn't expected a call back from my husband and secretly hoped he might have reflected a bit. When I told my mother-in-law that my husband had called, she laughed and joked, "Well, if Ethan isn't busy, maybe he could come pick us up." I told my husband I was planning on having your parents send me, but I appreciate you coming to get me. He replied, "Got it. I'll have Mom and Dad head back right now." After informing them that my husband was coming to pick me up, my in-laws seemed relieved and went on their way. I thanked the hospital staff repeatedly, and finished the paperwork before getting into my husband's car. He didn't apologize for before, but seemed to be in high spirits as he drove. Soon we were home, and I felt like crying from the pain, even from such a short ride. Thinking about all the mothers in the world enduring this pain and persevering through parenting made me feel a little anxious. With my husband's previous enthusiasm for parenting, I had to psych myself up, believing it'll be all right. I chalked up the troubles during my hospital stay to him being tired, or perhaps getting scolded by his dad more than he expected and sulking about it. I braced myself with the resolve that we would raise our baby together and opened the front door. Instantly, an appalling stench hit my nose. Hesitating to enter because of the unknown smell, my husband seemed unbothered and flung the living room door wide open. Immediately, the rotten odor of garbage overwhelmed me, making me feel nauseous. Wow, that reeks. Hey, clean this up, will you? He commanded authoritatively, a satisfied smirk on his face. I waited the 5 days you were in the hospital, so clean this up now. Can't live in a house that smells like this. Holding our baby, I nearly collapsed on the spot, but managed to restrain myself. How can you live like this? To let the house get so dirty? I asked, barely containing my anger, to which he nonchalantly replied, "It just happened with eating and sleeping. Food left out, washing, laundry and trash are left everywhere." The house was in a deplorable state, unrecognizable as our home. Seeing the mess, I couldn't help but blurt out, "Stop joking around. You never showed up at the hospital and you neglected all the housework. Before the birth, you used to help clean enthusiastically. Why have you suddenly stopped doing anything?" He responded incredulously, "Why should I be scolded? You love working, Madison. You worked hard even after we got married and until you took maternity leave. Housework is a wife's job, isn't it? I thought you'd be happy to have something to do when you got back, so I left it for you. Clean it up now that you're discharged." He had grown accustomed to the mess, nonchalantly relaxing on the couch in the fly-infested living room. It was impossible to live in such filth, let alone lay a clean towel down for the baby to sleep on. Attempting to clean while holding the baby was futile, so I yelled at my husband, who was scrolling on his phone, "Do you really think I can clean up in this state? If you're not gonna do it, hold our baby at the entrance. It's impossible to care for our baby in this mess." He sighed in exasperation. "Why do I have to take care of it? Housework and parenting are your job. You're supposed to do these things, right? And since when did you start ordering me around so much? This is why women are no good. Still acting like you're pregnant even though there's no baby inside anymore. You're the worst, trying to make excuses and boss your husband around." I reached my breaking point. "Enough. What's gotten into you? Why are you acting this way? What happened to you while I was in the hospital?" Tears streamed down my face as I confronted him, and he groaned, avoiding my gaze. Then, as if psyching himself up with a slap to his cheeks, he stood up with determination. "I've been too lenient with my wife, turning her into a useless woman. But not anymore. I've decided to properly educate my wife, as a husband should." He declared, his face contorted with effort. "I've done my part. I went to pick you and the baby up from the hospital to ensure I wasn't completely detached from parenting. I've made it clear that housework and parenting are your responsibilities. I'm becoming a responsible husband." Speechless at his transformation, I stood there as he announced, "I have plans to go out drinking with a buddy. Make sure the house is clean before I get back. Don't expect any help from me," and with that, he left. All I could do was stand there, unable to process the drastic change from the kind man I once knew. What could possibly have happened to turn the man who was once eager to share household duties and learn to be a good father into this? In my panicked state, the sight of the garbage-filled room pushed me over the edge, and tears began to fall, landing on my baby's cheeks. The baby, awakened by my crying, began to fuss, and I started crying out loud as well. "Mom, I just don't understand anymore. Help me," I pleaded as I sat in the entranceway and called my mother on my phone. As soon as the connection was made, I cried out, and my mother said, "I'll be right there," while my father drove her to me. She told me to wait outside rather than stay in the dirty house. Sitting on the front porch with my baby, I continued to cry quietly under the bright sunshine. When my parents arrived, My in-laws were with them. Upon seeing me, my mother-in-law immediately began to apologize profusely. My parents intervened to stop her, assuring that it was Ethan who was to blame. Once that was settled, I finally had a moment to ask why my in-laws were there in the first place. Tears welling up in her eyes, my mother-in-law confessed, "The truth is, we also doubted Ethan and feared he might be troubling you. So we decided to secretly visit your house. That's when we bumped into your parents and they kindly gave us a ride here. I'm truly sorry for all the trouble our son has caused." I had to somehow stop the conversation from turning into another round of apologies. My father-in-law, who was so angry he looked like he might start yelling at any moment, didn't utter a single word. But the way his temples throbbed red and twitched told me he was on the verge of an outburst. Neither my mother-in-law nor my father-in-law could get through to Ethan on the phone. That darn son of mine. Next time I see him, I'm gonna give him a piece of my mind, my father-in-law muttered, then took several deep breaths to calm down. After a while, he seemed more at peace and kindly said to me, "Now, you shouldn't be stressing yourself. Please, ride in my car. We'll handle the cleaning, just wait for us." With that, he and my mother-in-law took my child and me to the car and then entered the house. My parents followed suit, insisting on helping, and I could hear all four of their screams. No doubt they had opened the door to that bug-infested, foul-smelling living room. I hugged my baby tightly in the car, feeling terrible about the situation. Hours passed as my father-in-law went out to buy insecticide, and bags packed to the brim with trash were taken out to the collection area. Thanks to their efforts, when I entered the house again, there were no bugs, ventilation had been done, and the smell was much less offensive. It appeared they had cleaned every room, not just the living room. I felt a profound gratitude as my mother and mother-in-law prepared dinner. It had been a long time since I had someone else's home cooking. Having managed my diet strictly during pregnancy, it tasted even more delicious, and I polished it off in no time. The home-cooked meal helped ease my anger towards Ethan for a while. As we were waiting for Ethan's return, someone knocked at the door. Just as I rushed to see, my father-in-law reassured me, "You take it easy," and went to answer it. He answered and exclaimed, "Ethan?" I knew from my father-in-law calling my husband's name that Ethan had come home. I wondered why he would knock on the door. While quietly trying not to wake the sleeping child, we all went to see. To my surprise, a man was dragging Ethan into the house. Ethan's face was red and swollen, and he was sobbing loudly. Upon seeing me, the man introduced himself. "Nice to meet you. I'm Michael, a friend of Ethan's. We went out for drinks, and that's when I heard about you and the baby. I had no idea, and I am terribly sorry for causing such distress during this challenging time." I was surprised, but had the man raise his head to see my husband still sobbing. Noticing my gaze, Michael said, "This guy was boasting about defeating his lousy wife in an argument, so I asked for the details. Turns out what he did was so terrible, and even though I told him to go home, he wouldn't listen and didn't understand what he'd done wrong, so I ended up hitting him. I'm sorry. Since the mood for drinking was gone, it seemed they had disbanded. But he couldn't leave my weeping husband behind and brought him home. As I was apologizing for the inconvenience, suddenly my husband raised his face and started yelling. Just because you were out-argued, you resorted to violence. That's why you can't get married. You're single because you don't understand that household chores and parenting are a wife's job. It's the worst to be punched out of nowhere by someone who's just an onlooker. Look, I'm sorry for hitting you. I apologize for that. But seriously, what's going on with you? Last time we met, you were fine, right? Why are you suddenly saying things like a deadbeat husband?" Michael said, clearly baffled. Feeling the same, I realized my husband's attitude had indeed changed abruptly. "Ethan, you never said such things before. I was hospitalized for childbirth. You said household chores and parenting are a wife's duty, and that the husband should come first. Why did you suddenly start thinking that way?" When I asked again, my husband blurted out, "Household chores and parenting are a woman's job. That's what everyone says." I realized that I was wrong all along. Who's everyone? Your coworkers? Friends? Who exactly are you talking about? I asked him straight in the face, to which he replied shortly, "People on social media." What? You're taking information from the internet at face value? Are you out of your mind? Michael said, raising an eyebrow in disbelief. My husband, looking annoyed, thrust his smartphone at him. Look at this. It's obvious women should do household chores because they don't earn as much as men. Only women can have babies, so parenting is their job too. See, everyone agrees with this. Michael screamed in disbelief after looking at the screen. Do you believe this website? Are you insane? Taking the smartphone from Michael, I saw a website. It was belittling housewives, filled with countless stories praising the shoving of household and parenting duties onto wives. These opinions, my husband referred to as everyone's, were posted on an internet forum. Summarizing my still shouting husband's story, it seems he came across such sites right before I was hospitalized and began to think that he was just pampering his wife, being a useless husband. While alone at home during my hospital stay, he kept visiting these sites, convinced that he had been wrong. He commented about changing himself on these sites and became hooked on the supportive comments he received. As a result, my husband was filled with the belief that household chores and parenting are women's work because women are less capable at work and earn less money. If they have a complaint, they should just earn more. Unlike me, speechless with astonishment, both our parents and in-laws were furious. My in-laws were furious? It's unthinkable. We didn't raise you to be like this, they said in unison. Michael, whom my husband looked to for salvation, said coldly, I'm disappointed. I can't be friends with someone like this. As of today, I'm cutting ties with you. I joined in, confronting my husband. First off, why should I prioritize the opinions of faceless strangers online over us? Are the people writing more trustworthy to you than we are? That made my husband look at me as if he had an epiphany. To top it off, my mother said sharply, with a cold look, it seems none of the important people here, your dear Madison, your parents, your friends, share those values. If you still think you're right, then I guess we'll have to leave you, because your thinking is different from Ethan's. My father also said, as things stand, I can't leave my precious daughter Madison with you any longer. Madison, it's not too late. We're ready to welcome you, and it's okay to rely on us if it's tough. Just then, as if a spell had been lifted, my husband, who had been raging just a moment before, suddenly calmed down. No, but he kept repeating. When he looked up and saw my face clearly, his own turned pale as a ghost. For me, the most important thing is Madison. I wanted to be a good husband for her, sought out loads of information, and then with tears in his eyes, he prostrated himself before me with a burst of emotion. I'm so sorry, Madison. I was wrong. Seeing him like this, my father-in-law spoke in a calm voice. I have a question for you. When you were a kid, did you ever see me tell your mother that housework and parenting were a woman's job, or show that attitude? Did I appear that way to you as a father? He asked with tears in his eyes. My husband replied, Dad, you were always a wonderful father, fully supporting Mom by her side. Then he continued, I realized that I was too bound by what I read online, and I couldn't see what was around me. I'm truly sorry. Witnessing his sudden apologies, my parents said, Madison, it's up to you what to do next. We'll support you whatever you decide. After some thought, I told my husband, there won't be another chance. And I decided to forgive him this time. Since then, my husband has woken up from the spell of extreme online opinions and is struggling with unfamiliar housework and parenting as he engages with our baby. I wonder how long this will last, but my in-laws and my own parents seem to share my feelings as they continue to train him while he still strives on. He now says with concern, kids are adorable, but parenting is more physically demanding than I imagined. I now realize you've been doing all the housework and looking after the child alone while I'm at work. Thanks so much. If you're not feeling well, don't hesitate to rely on me. Looking at the smiling face of my husband holding our child, I think he might truly become a good father. I'm hoping these peaceful days will last forever. Do you have a spare room? I'm moving in, so you need to leave. My sister-in-law and mother-in-law, who had suddenly shown up at my brand new house, walked around sizing everything up, not even pausing to pay respects to my mother's memorial plaque before confronting me with this demand. My husband, Jason, acted like he didn't have a care in the world, lounging on the sofa with our cat, even as he heard what was happening. I looked up to the heavens and thought, this is the end. Filled with a fiery determination for revenge, I calmly said, "All right then, take care," and sold the house I had barely lived in. My name is Madison, and I am a 30-year-old office worker. Growing up in a single-parent household, I watched my mom struggle financially, so I worked hard to earn scholarships and relieve her burden as much as I could. She also wanted me to go to college, probably because she had a hard time without a degree herself. To fulfill her wish, I studied relentlessly while others were out having fun and got into a top university straight through. After graduating, I landed a job at a leading corporation. When the job offer came, my mom and I jumped for joy. On the day I got my first paycheck, we splurged on sushi in Beverly Hills, but we were both so tense in the upscale environment that we couldn't even taste the food. I was worried about fitting in at a glamorous company since I had always been focused on my studies, but my colleagues were very kind and I managed to get by. Even with a good salary, my mom and I couldn't shake our frugal habits. She continued working part-time and living in our small apartment. Our only indulgence became going out to enjoy delicious meals occasionally. Every time we did, my mom would say, "Having such a wonderful daughter who can treat me to meals like this, I am truly blessed." Thank you. That always made me feel proud and like all my efforts were worthwhile. But 4 years into my career, perhaps due to years of hardship, my mom's health began to decline. We went on a spa trip to hopefully improve her health, and although she seemed happy, her condition didn't get better. She kept going through cycles of rest and activity. I was consumed with worry. What would I do without her? That was all I could think about. That's when I met Jason. He was 2 years younger, a born salesman, and an outsourced sales representative with a silver tongue. Embarrassingly, at 27, I had never had a boyfriend. Between studying and the fear of being judged for my lack of experience at my age, I had always run from any potential relationships. And before I knew it, I was 27. Jason effortlessly became a part of my life. We both didn't have fathers and loved cats. And since neither of us could keep a pet, sharing favorite cat videos and dreaming of having one someday was what brought us close. After a while, he suggested we go to a cafe. I agreed, heart racing, and he texted back that he wanted to ask sooner but was worried about being turned down. I was over the moon, not realizing at the time that it was probably a line he had used before. But I believed he truly cared for me. And then, as our relationship started, something miraculous happened. My mom began to regain her spirits as she saw me dressing up and going out. She would say with a smile, "I'll take care of the house. You go and have a good time," almost as if she were the one going on the date. I had always thought sacrificing my happiness was the way to repay her, but I realized that my happiness made her happy too, just as her happiness was mine. As Jason and I became closer, my mom's health improved and she spent less time bedridden. When I told Jason about a conversation with my mother, he proposed saying, "Hey, why don't we just get married? That way, your mom can rest a little easier, you know?" Despite it only being 6 months into our relationship, I was completely smitten with Jason. His sister and mother were hairstylists who ran a salon together, and since they planned to live together in the future, he assured me that it wouldn't be a problem for him to live with my mother. When I introduced Jason to my mother, she was moved to tears and grasped both his hands, saying, "Please, take good care of Madison." Jason firmly held her hands in return and declared while looking into my mother's eyes, "I'm honored, ma'am. I might be younger and not very reliable, but I promise to make Madison happy." At that moment, I was so overjoyed, I almost cried. But looking back now, I realize he was nothing but a terrible jerk. I would later come to understand how little experience I had with the opposite sex, or rather how little I knew about the world. Following his declaration, Jason moved in with us, bringing along a slightly large suitcase. He suggested that it would be best to start living together in the house my mother was accustomed to. We welcomed Jason into our small apartment, and while my mother enthusiastically explained how everything worked, he barely listened and said, "Don't mind me. I doubt I'll be here much." But the reality was different. He truly never came home. On the rare occasions he did, he would just take a bath, sleep, and upon waking up, he would ask me, "Hey, can you give me some money for food?" At first, I didn't understand and asked him honestly, "Why? Why don't you just eat here? Besides, what about your share of the living expenses, Jason?" Jason had not been contributing financially to the household, and my mother and I were living just as we had before. He then laughed with a puzzled look on his face. "Living expenses? Why should I, when I'm hardly ever here?" I almost agreed with him for a second, but then I shook myself out of it and challenged him. "Wait a minute. We're married, right? That means we're supposed to share our lives together. You want me to come home every day?" "No, I understand that you're busy and maybe staying at friends' places, but I'd appreciate a message from you when that's the case." While we were dating, Jason was very attentive, always letting me know if he was going to be late for a date, and he never broke a promise. But after we got married, he stopped reading my texts and days would go by without a reply. When I brought this up, Jason suddenly turned ice cold and said, "I didn't think you were the kind of woman to say stuff like that," and turned away. His cold expression was something I had never seen before, and it chilled me to the bone. So I blurted out, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be possessive." And he instantly softened, saying, "I know, but come on, we're married, right? Don't you trust me?" he asked, tilting his head. I shook my head vigorously. "No, that's not it. I do trust you," I said, almost in tears. He looked into my eyes and whispered, "Thank you," then quickly added, "So about $100 will do, okay?" Fearing he might leave me, I gave in and handed over the money. In hindsight, that was the beginning of a nightmare. To avoid worrying my mother, I couldn't confide in her and explain that Jason was just on a lot of business trips. Alone with my thoughts, I continued this strange marriage where I would give money to Jason whenever he occasionally came home. When I finally couldn't stand it anymore and confronted him, he simply wrote his name on a divorce paper and handed it to me, saying, "If you get sick of this, you can leave me at any time." It's strange how humans work. Being given such an option made it impossible for me to leave. Jason had clearly read my mind. My mom noticed something was off with me, but she never tried to address it. As half a year passed, for some reason, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law started coming over to our place more often. Even though they supposedly ran a beauty salon, they would show up on weekdays or weekends without even bringing a small gift, sit in Jason's room while he was out and say, "Don't mind us. Just some tea and snacks will do," and they would stay for hours, sometimes even joining us for lunch or dinner. When I eavesdropped on their conversations, they were mostly bad-mouthing others, creating a toxic atmosphere, a really unpleasant atmosphere. One day, loud enough for me to hear, my sister-in-law said, "Wow, I can't believe he married such a plain Jane. Her fashion sense is so drab." And with reckless abandon, my mother-in-law added, "Well, if she were attractive, she'd probably cheat on you." They laughed heartily together. They didn't specify who, but I knew they were talking about me. When I was reeling from the shock and covering my ears, I heard the damning words, "Well, she's pretty much a good cash cow, isn't she?" And with only her mom around, said my sister-in-law. My mother-in-law chimed in with a worldly tone. "Seems easy enough to get money out of her. Plus, we get to do whatever we want." They cackled again. I wanted to storm out of the room and tell them to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Since that day, I've been feeling really down. Jason, as usual, didn't come home and didn't even read my messages. During this time, I failed to notice my mom's health deteriorating again. Then, one day at work, I got a call. My mom had been rushed to the hospital by ambulance. When I got there, I found out she had fallen down the stairs of our apartment complex, severely injuring her back. The doctor said that, given her age, she'd likely have to use a wheelchair from now on. From what I was told, Mom had been feeling under the weather for quite some time, experiencing frequent bouts of dizziness. It seems that dizziness was the culprit behind her fall down the stairs. My mom kept apologizing. "I'm so sorry, Madison. I'm really sorry," over and over, and I just shook my head, crying. I was determined to break through this tough situation. Given that my mom's hospital stay would be quite long, including rehabilitation, I decided to look for a wheelchair-accessible home. Fortunately, we had lived frugally, so there was a decent amount of savings. My mom always loved looking at home ads in the newspapers, often saying how much she'd like to live in such houses. I held on to the hope that buying the home she dreamt of might bring her spirit back. When I asked Jason for his opinion, he casually said, "Why not? I'd like my own room. Oh yeah, let's get a cat too." And seeing Jason's happy face for the first time in a long while made me foolishly happy, so I enthusiastically started house hunting. Luckily, I found the perfect spec house right in our neighborhood. It was completely wheelchair accessible. I felt it was destiny and made an immediate purchase. I could afford a down payment of around $360,000, and thanks to being employed by a top-notch company, the mortgage was easily approved. Of course, Jason didn't contribute a dime, but that had become the norm. He only visited my mom once at the hospital. By the way, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, despite their frequent negative comments, have always been supportive and helpful during this difficult time. Despite their frequent visits to our house, they never came to see my mother. I hurried to finalize the house deal before my mom was discharged and managed to move us in perfectly. It was honestly exhausting to balance work and moving, but thinking of my mom and Jason's happy faces, I pushed through. When my mom came to the new house in her wheelchair, her eyes sparkled as she looked around our model home-like place and exclaimed like a child, "I can't believe I get to live in a house like this. It feels like a dream." Jason also seemed to like his new room as he started coming home more often. Then we went to the pet store together and brought home 2 adorable cats. Both Jason and my mom doted on the cats, and our home was filled with lively energy. Just as I was starting to think everything might turn out okay, tragedy struck again. 2 months after moving in one morning, my mom didn't wake up. I found it strange and went to check on her, only to discover she had passed away. Cold. I called an ambulance, but it was too late. She had suffered a heart attack. With the new house and everything else seeming so pointless now, I was overwhelmed by despair and hardly remembered the funeral proceedings. Jason acted the part of the dutiful, gentle husband at the funeral, but as soon as we got home, he did nothing but flop on the couch and say, "Man, I'm beat," tossing the urn carelessly on a shelf. He then asked me, "When's dinner?" As I sat holding my mother's memorial plaque and just played with the cat. Seeing this, I finally snapped back to reality. I had realized a long time ago that my marriage was a mistake, but I had been pretending everything was fine so as not to worry my mother. I also didn't want to admit my failure to myself. But can I really call him my husband if he doesn't even comfort me as I mourn my beloved mother? As I was staring at my so-called husband, dumbfounded, the doorbell rang. When I went to answer it, my sister-in-law and mother-in-law, still dressed in their mourning clothes, barged in saying, "Why, this place is huge. Why didn't you tell us about it?" You see, neither my mother nor I had given my mother-in-law our new address. I assumed Jason would tell them, but it seemed he hadn't bothered, perhaps out of disinterest. As they walked around the house, eyeing everything greedily, they smirked at each other and said, "You've got spare rooms, right? We'll live here. You can leave." It seemed they were under the impression that Jason had bought the house. Meanwhile, Jason continued to relax on the couch with the cat, seemingly oblivious to everything. Looking up to the heavens, I thought it was all over. And then my mother-in-law, still hyped up, said, "The apartment we're living in now is so noisy. The landlord comes every day just because we're a bit behind on the rent." That's when I realized their frequent visits were to escape. They were escaping from their landlord. My sister-in-law smiled and said, "I'll take the upstairs south room." Madison always had a talent for choosing the best spots, didn't she? They saw my mother's death as an opportunity to shamelessly move into my home. Naturally, I thought, I'll send these people packing to hell. Fine, I'll leave. Take care then. As soon as I agreed, they nearly jumped for joy and said to Jason, "Jason, we can live together again. You really can't manage without us, can you?" Jason, perhaps too tired to care, lazily laughed and said, Yeah, I'm off to bed," and retreated to his room. With a spring in their step, my sister-in-law and mother-in-law told me, "We'll be moving in on Tuesday, in 2 weeks, so make sure you're out by then," and left. "Next week, huh?" I murmured, carefully placing my mother's memorial plaque, portrait, and ashes on the shelf, and whispered to her picture, "Watch over me, Mom," as if she was smiling back at me, saying, "Give them hell." I promptly filled out the divorce papers I had prepared earlier and rushed them to the courthouse, then started plotting my revenge. Come Monday, I was sitting at a cafe terrace with a view of the new house, hat pulled down over my eyes, waiting. There was a for sale sign by the new house's door plate. The autumn sky was clear, and as I was leisurely reading a book, a moving truck pulled up in front of the house, and out stepped Jason, my sister-in-law and mother-in-law. I knew that Jason had been helping them move over the weekend. I had politely asked him, "Please don't come back until the moving day. If I see you, I might get sentimental." They were perplexed by the for sale sign, but Jason nonchalantly suggested it might be a prank and tried to open the door with his key, which of course didn't fit. I had changed the locks. Jason was frantically rattling the keys. Both my sister-in-law and mother-in-law looked on with anxious expressions. Frantically, he fiddled with the key as the movers looked on, ready to start. "What's the meaning of this for sale sign?" my sister-in-law and mother-in-law demanded, irritation rising in their voices. Jason, still seemingly unfazed, said, "I'll just make a call." And that's when my phone vibrated. I ignored it. And as he couldn't get through to me, panic began to set in on his face. The two women looked on anxiously as they and Jason received frosty stares from the movers. Finally, he called someone else, the real estate agency listed on the sign. And there I was, sipping my coffee. "Hello, I'm calling about a property." Yes. "It's being sold without my consent. Could you come over here, please?" Jason began to explain on the phone when he was interrupted. "It's already being sold by the owner." "No, that can't be right. Do you want to sell it if I want to buy it? What are you talking about?" Please hold on," and he hung up the phone. Then, my sister-in-law and mother-in-law, with faces like furious demons, stormed up to Jason and demanded, "Hold on a minute. Isn't this the house you bought?" "No. I mean, it's not that I bought it, but isn't it considered joint property if you're married? Madison can't just sell it without consent," he retorted with surprising confidence, so I stepped in to deal with it myself. Surprised, my sister-in-law and mother-in-law turned to me and nearly snapped, "What have you done with this house?" I responded with a sly voice, "What have I done?" "I sold it. It's my property after all. Feel free to buy it if you want." "Oh, I thought living here meant that kind of arrangement. I played dumb." Jason turned pale and started, "Hey, you can't just do whatever you want," to which I shot back, "What are you talking about? You haven't contributed a dime. And to talk about joint property when you haven't even contributed to living expenses since we got married. How dare you?" For the first time in my life, I was yelling at someone out of anger. Jason was taken aback by the sudden resistance from a woman who used to be compliant to him. I continued to press Jason, "You better give me back all the money I've given you. I'm ready with a lawyer," and I shoved a business card and a claim for alimony in his face. I've always kept a household account book, so I had carefully calculated all the money I've given to Jason. Though it's only been a year and a half of marriage, the money I've handed over amounts to nearly $20,000. When Jason floundered, saying, "That was supposed to be for our living expenses, wasn't it?" my sister-in-law and mother-in-law chimed in, "Exactly. What are you even saying? A housewife receiving living expenses is a given. Claiming that back is terrifying for an elite woman." To which I shouted back, "Shut up. Don't meddle in someone else's business. And you too have some nerve." It felt like something inside me had exploded. Both my sister-in-law and mother-in-law seemed overwhelmed by my outburst and began to tremble, holding each other. There was no way I was going to lose to these women who were always bad-mouthing others behind their backs. Jason started to back away, looking like he might run off at any moment. He was the type of man who would run when things got tough. "No use in running," I said firmly. "I'm gonna make sure you settle this properly." It seemed my resolve had an impact. Jason, too, collapsed just like my sister-in-law and mother-in-law, looking completely lost. The movers, looking troubled, said, Where should we move the items to?" I replied, though it felt cruel, "I don't know. Ask them." Wondering where to move to when they don't even have a house, I just smiled sweetly. What happened to them after they lost their place to go, I don't know. They probably rented a new apartment through some contacts of Jason. Jason had quit his job at a company soon after marrying me. He was scouted for a nightclub because of his Playboy skills. Every night, he used the money from me like water. And while it seemed to go well at first, by the time I built our new house, he was scraping by. My sister-in-law and mother-in-law, unaware of such things, had come to depend on Jason's supposed financial strength based on the new house he had built and moved into as soon as my mother passed away. They used to say, "The beauty salon business is going well lately. We can support you, so you don't have to worry about anything." But in reality, the beauty salon managed by my mother-in-law had long since gone under. Swamped with debt and lacking real skills as hairdressers, they couldn't hold down jobs at any salon they went to. They had both been planning to rely on each other and ended up failing. Eventually, Jason got into trouble with some shady characters and disappeared. It was a fitting end for such a deadbeat man. My sister-in-law and mother-in-law are also missing, and I can't help but think they haven't exactly had the best lives. I couldn't get alimony from Jason, but I've come to see it as the cost of a life lesson. After the divorce, people have said I seem different, and somehow I've entered what you'd call my prime time for attracting others. It seems I used to be seen as serious and quiet, but now there's a certain settled confidence about me that has become attractive. I had been quite put off by the idea of marriage for a while, but as I started dining out with men more often, whenever the mood seemed to be right for something more, I'd excuse myself to go home because of my cats. Their reaction in such moments is quite telling of their character, so it's been a good strategy for sizing up men. In reality, I live in a pet-friendly apartment with my 2 cats. The other day, as I was sorting through my mother's belongings, I found a letter addressed to me. It was dated the month before she passed, right around when I'd settled into my new place. The letter was filled with various memories from my childhood through to my professional life, and it ended with her usual phrase, "To live in such a nice home, to lead such a good life. I've been blessed with a wonderful daughter." Thank you so much. I hugged that letter from my mother tightly and cried my eyes out for a while. Buying that new place definitely wasn't a waste, I've come to realize. From here on out, I'm committed to living positively and earnestly, keeping my mother's words close to my heart, and hoping to make someone feel as rewarded by me as I felt by her. My name is Amelia. I wasn't raised in a wealthy household, but I somehow managed to land a job and even get married. My husband's name is Edward, and he works at a luxury hotel. I really thought I was going to have a happily ever after, but I never imagined it would end up like this. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that my childhood home was below average in terms of wealth. I was brought up in such a home, but I don't hold even a speck of resentment towards my parents. They gave up all their luxuries for me, took me places to play, and taught me about the different cultures of those places. I wonder if they loved geography, but as a child, I often thought they were trying too hard for my sake. I didn't want to make my parents go through any more trouble for me. So I decided that I would work as soon as I graduated from middle school. My mother would say to me, "You really should at least finish high school. It might be tough to find a job in the future." And my father would add, "That's right. We have enough saved to send you to high school." I was really happy about their feelings. But even more than that, I had a strong desire to make life easier for my parents as soon as possible. "It's all right," I said with little certainty. "The sooner I start working, the sooner I'll start earning more." But just like my parents said, there was no guarantee that I would be able to find a job anywhere. At that time, I had a friend who was a foreign girl who had immigrated when we started middle school. Her name was Jessica, and like me, her family wasn't rich. Maybe that's why we got along so well and always played together. Since Jessica could speak some English, we managed to have conversations. Without realizing it, I was learning Spanish while talking with her. By the time I was in the 9th grade, I could hold conversations in Spanish pretty well. Perhaps it was my Spanish skills that did it, because lo and behold, a certain travel agency decided to hire me. They saw value in my ability to speak Spanish. Jessica and I, having both left school after junior high, began working and gradually lost touch. But I was single-minded in my work, determined to earn money. As time flew by, I found myself at 26 years old. There was a lounge in a hotel that I frequently used for work. It was a high-end place, but cozy, and the snacks and coffee menu were reasonably priced. We would have our meetings there with the staff. At that time, the waiter working there was Edward. The hotel hosted many foreigners, so he seemed to speak Spanish as well. Sometimes I would be there with foreign guests too. Maybe it was because we both spoke Spanish, but something just clicked between us. Edward struck up a conversation, and before I knew it, we were in a whirlwind romance that led to marriage. For a girl from a poor family to get married, it's quite a deep feeling when you think about it. However, I was expecting to start a new and exciting life. Unfortunately, the reality turned out to be the exact opposite. When we were getting married, Edward had a request. "If it's okay with you, Amelia, I'd like to live within my family home." The reason was that Edward had lost his father a few years back, and he was worried about his mother living alone. Her energy levels were dipping, and it seemed like a good idea to have someone watch over her. Plus, at the time, I was a remote worker who could do my job from home. I guess that's why Edward thought it would be convenient, since I was always home to keep an eye on his mother and manage the household chores. On the flip side, Edward often had long hours at work and wasn't home much. With his scarce days off, having me, a home-based worker, around must have seemed like a good arrangement to him. But I couldn't immediately agree to it. That's because when I first went to Edward's family home to introduce myself before marrying him, his mother had gone silent after asking about my education. "Amelia, which university did you graduate from?" When I honestly replied, "Well, I didn't go to college. I only finished middle school," my mother-in-law just looked at me in silence for a while. It was clear from her expression that she looked down on me. "Oh? Only middle school?" Well, she said, eyeing me with disdain. Given this history, I figured living with her wouldn't go very smoothly. So I mentioned it to Edward casually. "Edward, don't you think your mom doesn't exactly see me in the best light?" When I asked, he chuckled a bit and said, "Nah, that's not true. Mom trusts me, and I'm sure she has no bad feelings toward my wife either." Hearing that made me think maybe I was overthinking things. Edward also promised that if anything came up, he would speak to his mother on my behalf. With that assurance, I agreed to move in with his family. But once I actually started living there, things were far from perfect. It was like a slap of reality. Whenever Edward and I visited his family's house, his mother would speak to him with such warmth. "Edward, thank you. I'm so grateful you're living with me." And Edward would respond, "Of course, I knew it would help you out." From my perspective, they seemed like such a close mother and son. But towards me, my mother-in-law's attitude was completely different. Cold even. "Well, Amelia, just make sure you don't hold Edward back," she would say emotionlessly, as if she was instructing me. As if she was instructing a servant, it was clear she still looked down on me. I can't help but think that. But at that moment, Edward stood up for me. "Don't worry, Amelia is doing a great job working, too." But when I mentioned this, my mother-in-law momentarily turned stern, a detail I did not miss. I figured I should just speak to Edward if things ever got troublesome and decided to handle it my way, thinking things would work out since we were living together. We were family after all, and I didn't want any weird vibes between us. That's the spirit with which we started our cohabitation. But reality, as it often does, didn't quite bend in a favorable direction. Once, as I was working on my computer as usual, my mother-in-law barged into my room and said rather angrily, "Hey Amelia, when are you gonna clean my room? It needs to be done by 10 a.m. every day." I was taken aback since I had never heard of such a rule. Sure, I agreed to do household chores, but we never discussed to what extent. If she had just kindly told me from the beginning, that would have been fine. After all, I have my own job and can't be available all the time. However, arguing wouldn't be mature, so I quickly wrapped up my work, apologized, and started cleaning her room. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law was just lounging in the living room, watching TV and munching on snacks. Edward had expressed concerns about her mother's health, but she seemed well enough to clean her own room. I had imagined she might struggle with walking, but she was more sprightly than I thought. And once the cleaning was done, she was already commanding. Now, get started on dinner, and I like it bland. I won't stand for anything too strong. She even told me to go shopping for ingredients right away. I thought it was too early to start prepping, but then figured I'd get it done and go back to my work. But when I returned from shopping, my mother-in-law was, unsurprisingly, still slacking off. It's hard not to get annoyed, but I chose to hold back and just get things done. Probably being tested by her. I believed she'd understand in time. But that hope lingered for months on end. There were days when the complaint was that I was 5 minutes late in getting the laundry in, or that the bathtub wasn't cleaned properly. Nitpicking to an almost obsessive degree. Before I knew it, I ended up doing all the chores around the house. And yet, my mother-in-law just lazed around at her leisure. Honestly, if she has the energy to nitpick, she could very well do some chores herself. I started to worry that if this kept up, it would start affecting my job, too. That was the last thing I needed, so I decided to wait until the evening to talk to Edward about it. Once my mother-in-law had gone to bed, I told him everything. Hey, I think your mom just doesn't like me. I'm getting so tired of being constantly criticized. But Edward just chuckled and said, come on, that can't be true. Mom's a kind person. There won't be any issues as long as Amelia doesn't do anything strange. Please try to get along with her. He just wouldn't believe me. Maybe it's because she's always doting on him and never complains to me. In fact, when Edward's around, my mother-in-law would say, Amelia, why don't you take a break and have some tea? But even knowing that, there's a limit to my patience with this kind of life. I'm constantly chased by household chores all day and end up having to work on my job at night. To be honest, my trust in Edward is starting to fade. If nothing changes, I might just collapse from all this stress. And then, in the midst of all this, my mother-in-law dropped a bombshell. Amelia, I'll be away for about a week in about 3 months from now, so make sure you keep the house in order, okay? She sprang this on me out of nowhere, and when I asked, what's going on? She said, Edward suggested we go on an overseas vacation. That's my boy, always knowing how much I love traveling abroad. I'm looking forward to it. I was stunned because Edward hadn't mentioned a word of this to me. And to top it off, it sounded like I was being left out, expected to stay behind and house sit. I needed to talk to Edward about this right away, so I brought it up that night. But his response was, oh, Mom already told you? But you're coming too, right? It turned out we had our wires crossed. It seems my mother-in-law had lied to me. Even if Edward wants me to go, there's no way I can enjoy a trip with her. In frustration, I told him I don't want to go. I can't possibly have a good time with your mother. And then Edward completely lost it and lashed out. Amelia, what the heck are you saying? How long are you going to keep up this childish nonsense? I won't allow you to speak ill of Mom like that. You better reflect on this. It's a vacation abroad, for crying out loud, and I want to enjoy it too, he retorted. I was just shocked. I can't believe he won't trust me this far. With things like this, staying in this house has become nothing but agony for me. So to prove to Edward that what I'm saying is true, I decided to take action the next day. Edward was off work, so the three of us were having breakfast together. That's when I challenged my mother-in-law. You're trying to exclude me from the trip abroad, aren't you? My mother-in-law replied with a defiant tone. Oh, did I say that? Amelia, if you want to come, you should just come along, right? But Edward interjected, hey, Amelia, don't you get it yet? Apologize to Mom. Why are you being so defiant? You're not a child anymore. Even so, what I said was the truth. I have a stronger desire to clear everything up. I really want Edward to understand. But before I could argue back, my mother-in-law gave me the worst insult. Well, maybe Amelia should just stay home, right? It's too early for someone like you to travel abroad. You won't appreciate the experience with your lack of education. And besides, lazing around at home every day without working. Do you even deserve to go abroad? You know it, don't you? I was floored. To think she still believed I was unemployed. I had explained about my job even during our greetings. I've told you what my job is, haven't I? When I confronted her, she looked down on me. What job? But not Weck? Don't joke with me. You're just playing on the computer at home. It's been getting on my nerves every day. There's no way you're making money with that. You're just stealing Edward's earnings. She blurted that out. That really made me mad. But before I could retort, she went even further. I have Edward, and that's enough for me. Edward can speak Spanish and works at a renowned hotel. There's no need to waste his earnings on a woman like you, uneducated and unemployed. A bottom feeder like you should just leave as soon as possible. She just went on and on. After all her tirades, Edward must have understood what I was saying. As I looked at Edward, he made an unexpected remark. Well, I can understand how Mom feels. Maybe Amelia needs to cool off a bit. He said nonchalantly, as if he was fed up with me. At that moment, I made up my mind. I can't follow this parent and child anymore. My mother-in-law told me to get out, but I still wanted to confirm. Am I really supposed to leave? Laughing, she said, of course. Leave as soon as you can. We don't need bottom feeders like you around. So I said, understood, and started preparing to move out. I just nodded to the two of them and left the house. As I was leaving, my mother-in-law called after me with a sneer, enjoy your poor life as it suits a bottom feeder like you. But they don't realize that retribution will come upon them. About 3 months after I left the house, around the time when they were scheduled to go on their trip abroad, my mother-in-law called me. Amelia, I finally got through to you. What in the world is going on? She sounded quite frantic. But first, I said, I'm surprised you managed to call this number. She replied, of course. I tried several times and couldn't get through. I even called your parents' house to get your new number. I did tell my parents that either Edward or my mother-in-law might call, but if they do, they should call back at this number. What's wrong? I asked her. In a panicked tone, she said, what's wrong? We're getting all sorts of collection letters. Help me out. I didn't know about any of this. Well, that's expected. You haven't been paying the utilities, have you? I simply answered what was expected, but my mother-in-law seemed to be in a world of her own. I had absolutely thought Edward was covering our living expenses. To find out you were paying for everything, why didn't you tell me? I had no idea you were making that much money. It's kind of too late to be bringing this up now, but maybe Edward finally told her the truth. That's right. I had already started my own business, using the expertise I gained from the travel agency I used to work for. And now it had grown to the point of earning $20 million, being widely accepted around the world. What shocked my mother-in-law even more was probably Edward's income. Just because he worked in a lounge at a well-known hotel doesn't mean he was raking in the cash. If anything, Edward was just an average Joe on the payroll. On the lower end, I'd say. In Spanish? That hotel is crawling with Spanish speakers. Even if he could speak it, it wasn't anything to write home about. There's no way his income could cover the living expenses for 3 people. In reality, just making ends meet for himself was all he could manage. So it's ridiculous that she hadn't realized until a collection notice came that I was the one paying all the living expenses for my husband's family. But the more I listened to my mother-in-law, the more appalling facts came to light. The reason why she insisted on me living with them wasn't to keep an eye on her. It was because she had been living off my father-in-law's wealth. But blinded by a temporary influx of cash, she had spent lavishly until there was nothing left. That's when she turned to Edward, who she presumed was earning well. But Edward knew his income was low, and he was somewhat aware of my earnings, which is why he turned to me for help. Hearing this just reconfirmed what a hopeless pair they were. But their irresponsibility doesn't end there. By the way, are you managing to make the card payments? I asked. Suddenly raising her voice, my mother-in-law exclaimed, exactly! Both Edward and I have bills piling up. Since I moved in with them, I've started to receive more and more credit card statements addressed to both of them. The amounts due each month kept climbing, and before I knew it, they amounted to a significant sum. They amounted to quite a sum. The level of their luxury spending was beyond me. I have no idea what they were doing without paying the living expenses, but for sure, Edward's bills had surpassed his salary. And my mother-in-law hadn't kicked her old habits of lavish spending. It seemed they both had gotten themselves into debt, now totaling over $40,000. And what's more shocking is they thought Edward would somehow manage it. If it was just a bit of debt, as my mother-in-law put it, Edward thought Amelia would take care of it if things got tough. The level of dependency in grown adults was appalling. Beyond exasperation, I was starting to feel the danger. So when my mother-in-law brazenly said, "So Amelia, you can sort this out for us, right?" I was astonished she could be so audacious. I made it clear to her, after all that's been said and done, you're asking for help now? There's no way I'm helping. That's when Edward suddenly took the phone. "Hey Amelia, you're my wife. You have a duty to help us out. Do something. We can't pay this off." I couldn't fathom their nerve, but I did offer him a glimmer of mercy. "So you want to come over? I might consider it if you do." He was immediately enthusiastic. "Oh yeah? You'll let us stay and you'll sort out the money? Then let's do that. Where's your place? I'll head there right now." He was so eager. I had to be honest. "Well, if you can make it, I'm in Hawaii right now." "I have a vacation home here," I said. Both Edward and my mother-in-law couldn't hide their shock. "What do you mean Hawaii? We can't afford to go there right now," Edward panicked. I calmly replied, "Huh? Weren't you going to travel abroad? Just swing by Hawaii. Your mother would love it. And you did ask my family for my phone number, right? Didn't you realize it was an international number?" I added, "Oh, and don't forget the cost of this call. It adds up if you're on for a long time." And to drive the point home, I said, "If we divorced, I might think about helping with the money." To that, Edward was quick to reply, "All right, I got it. Let's just get divorced first, then." It seems he had realized his debts were not something he could exchange for anything. So I told him I'd deliver the divorce papers once I got back to California and ended the call. Was it about a week later? I had returned to California, made sure to have the divorce papers properly written up, and the divorce went through without a hitch. Edward looked quite gaunt, so I guess he's been living pretty lean these last few days. But he mentioned something at that time. Turns out he had been counting on my money for the overseas trip as well. Hearing that didn't even surprise me anymore. They probably thought I would pay off their debts, but of course I had no intention whatsoever of doing that. What I proposed was, first of all, for both of them to stop living so lavishly, and then for Edward and my mother-in-law to work their tails off. I told them if they did, they could eventually pay off the debt and at least manage the bare necessities. When Edward heard this, he lashed out, "Hey, that's not what you promised. You were supposed to think about the debt." But I was like, "That's why I did you a favor by thinking of a way for you guys to handle your debt repayment. So good luck. Once you can afford to travel abroad again, I'll invite you to my Hawaii villa," I said with a touch of sarcasm, and left their place. Afterward, they both seemed to be working themselves to the bone from dawn till dusk, barely scraping by. It's probably a good lesson for them, since they've had it easy until now. On a different note, I heard that Jessica also built a house in Hawaii, and I had a reunion with her after so long. She took up a job that took her around the world after graduating middle school, and now seems to be a company president just like me. She had her parents come over to the house she bought, and they are living it up together. So I called my parents over from California and we started living here. Now I sometimes visit Jessica's place. We both feel blessed to be able to give back to our parents, and we encourage each other as we work hard at our jobs. Such a bad husband. Doing this on your wedding day. Well, this is the best way to relax when you're nervous, isn't it? On the wedding day, I glanced into the dressing room, and there were Evan and Sarah entwined without a stitch on. What a pain, this happily ever after wedding show-off of Emily's. That's cruel. What's the main attraction saying? I'm not the main attraction. It's funny though, Emily doesn't look the part of the star either, does she? No matter how much she dresses up, a plain Jane is just a plain Jane. She's just making a spectacle of herself. I was the only one who was swept up in the wedding fever. Until just now, my heart had been racing, but it suddenly calmed down. Sarah looks more fitting in her current indecent form than any white dress. They've insulted me plenty, so why not make them today's main attraction? My name is Emily Smith, and I'm 32 years old. I met him at a social gathering, and after a year, he finally proposed. Not in some fancy restaurant with a sparkling diamond ring, but in our usual pub. His name is Evan. We are both happily married now. We are both straightforward people. Let's keep this going. We toasted with beers. Even though he proposed, we didn't get married right away. He respected my wish for a modest wedding, so we planned it for a year later. Touring various wedding venues and bridal fairs was a fresh and fun experience. Being called groom and bride made us blush and smile at each other. I had heard about it, but I never realized you can't just rush into a wedding right after deciding to have one. Yeah, I thought a year later was way too far out. But it's actually okay, right? And the cost we thought was a joke turned out to be real. There's a reason the wedding is set for a year later. Here's this month's share. Thank you. Got it? Thanks. I handed over $1,500 to Evan. He quickly counted the bills and pocketed the money. This is for our wedding in a year. We each contribute $1,500 every month, and by the end of the year, we should have saved up around $40,000. Evan is in charge of managing it. $1,500 a month is a lot, but we can do it because we both live with our parents. By the way, which venue looks good to you? I guess your mom's place is nice, right? Actually, my mother works at a wedding venue. I was worried Evan would feel awkward at my mom's workplace, but he was the one who insisted on it. The venue was really nice, and it's a big help that they'll give us the family discount. Evan is practical like that. This is how our wedding preparations went smoothly. We've already met each other's parents. We wanted to discuss things before meeting at the venue, so we started visiting each other's homes more often. It could have been at a cafe, but Evan's mom treats me like family. She says, come over anytime, so I've been hanging out at my in-laws' place. Wow, they have a dessert buffet these days? How can I eat a lot in a tight dress? Oh, Mom, it's a wedding. It would be weird if the groom's mother is just chowing down. That's true, what a shame. We always had such light-hearted discussions. But then Sarah showed up, and the atmosphere changed completely. No way. Evan is getting married for real? That's hilarious. As usual, I was visiting my in-laws when she barged in. Without introducing herself, she pointed at me and laughed. Is this who you're marrying? Well, I guess that's about right for Evan. She's a young and cute girl with soft curls and glossy lips. In contrast, I was in a hoodie and barely had any makeup on since I wasn't going anywhere. Her words made me angry, but I wasn't dressed to confidently talk back. It was frustrating, but I bit my lip and looked to Evan for help. Evan scratched his head, looking a bit embarrassed. Come on, Sarah, that's rude. Then Evan introduced her. She's his cousin, apparently. Sarah is 5 years younger than Evan, but acts way more superior. Evan is over 30, can't be picky anymore. Huh? So, this is the kind of person that's realistic for him. Evan just laughed it off. My in-laws scolded Sarah for her rudeness. I was smiling on the outside, wondering if we really had to invite this rude girl to the wedding, but I was annoyed inside. Sarah had just arrived, but my mother-in-law suggested Evan drive her home. Sarah left the house looking displeased. After Evan and Sarah left, my in-laws apologized. Emily, we're so sorry. Sarah doesn't think before she speaks. She's always treated Evan like a little follower since they were kids. Maybe she's upset that you're taking him away. A cute little girl's follower, huh? Is that why he couldn't stand up for me, because he can't go against the boss? Ridiculous for adults. I'm not bothered at all, I replied cheerfully, trying not to let my in-laws sense my true feelings. The next weekend, there was a big problem during our meeting at the venue. Sorry, I'm late. Who was it again? Oh, right, Emily. You blend in too much. I had to look for you. Sarah had followed Evan to our meeting place. After all, I have way better taste than Emily. If it's a wedding, you gotta go big or go home. Leaving a confused me behind, the two of them huddled close together. Sarah had taken it for granted to join the wedding planning. Hey, Evan, don't you think these flowers are nice? Yeah, that's nice. Evan was flanked by two women. One was chirping away with suggestions, clearly enjoying herself, yet she was an outsider. And there I was, the actual bride-to-be, wearing a gloomy expression. It felt like a bizarre scene. The wedding planner, with a vague smile, nodded along to Sarah, trying to include me by saying, "The bride thinks," but was drowned out by Sarah's excited voice. After a while, Sarah glanced back and forth between me and the planner, letting out a chuckle. Hey, we're not planning a funeral here. It's seriously killing the vibe that this spot is so gloomy. If you're not into it, Emily, maybe you should just head home? Right now, I must be sporting the most idiotic look imaginable. I can't close my gaping mouth. Sarah's behavior is so incomprehensible to me. She's starting to seem like an alien. It was Emily who wanted to have a wedding, but to then just dump all the decisions on Sarah is just not cool. You just wanted to dress up and have everybody make a fuss over you, didn't you? Evan was an alien too. Even though he seemed so normal up until a moment ago, I can't wrap my head around this. It's cool. I love organizing events. I often do barbecues and Christmas parties with friends. Leave the wedding planning to me. You're awesome, Sarah. I'm counting on you. Yeah, I guess. At this rate, my wedding will become Sarah's thing. I want to scream no, I hate this, but no voice comes out. The more I panic, the more my throat constricts. Evan and Sarah are laughing hysterically. Just then, a voice came from behind. It was slow and polite, not loud, but carried well. The laughter from Evan and Sarah stopped. When I turned around, my mother was there. Evan, who is this woman? She asked. She seems rather like the bride. Evan quickly distanced himself from Sarah. In a contrived manner, he twined his arm around mine and turned a smile to my mother. I apologize, but you're causing a disturbance for the other couples here, so could you please keep it down a bit? He said. Yes, sorry. Thank you. My mother smiled sweetly, yet there was a strong pressure about her. She forcefully sent Sarah home. That evening, my mother shook her head in disbelief, worried about us. Evan seemed like such a serious guy, right? She said. Bringing a woman who looks like a mistress to the wedding planning, what's gotten into him? Evan is Sarah's underling, I explained. Underling? My mother just shrugged. What's that about? We're not in grade school. My mother, who has been involved in many weddings, says that troubles often lurk behind the seemingly happy wedding ceremonies. Of course, the stars of a wedding are the bride and groom, she said. But often parents and others interject and try to shape the wedding to their own liking. I don't care if she's a cousin or a boss, the wedding is for Emily and Evan. Since then, Sarah stopped showing up. Thankfully, the planning proceeded smoothly, but Evan seemed bored. He would only respond with, I think it's fine, to anything asked. Eventually, even his tuxedo was left up to me with a careless, do whatever you like. Not just in the planning, but generally, he's been pretty indifferent towards me. Maybe the reality of marriages is bringing up all sorts of anxieties. We're probably both experiencing cold feet. I remember my mother once said, many couples fight before the wedding. It's understandable since it's a big change. We're supposed to overcome these little bumps and grow as a couple. After several arguments and makeups, a year flew by in no time. It's finally the day of the wedding. Man, I'm nervous. Evan can't seem to sit still, pacing from one end of the bridal suite to the other. The speech we practiced is ready to go. No matter how many times I reassure him, he's still restless. We exchange wry smiles when, without knocking, the door swings open. Hey, where's the bride and groom? My face froze in an instant. It was Sarah. There you are. Haven't you two done your makeup or gotten dressed yet? You're so plain I didn't even notice. Laughing, Sarah was in a stark white dress, and a miniskirt above the knee at that, bare-legged. Such an outfit would seem adorable to a child about 3 years old, but it's preposterous for an adult. She said she came early to get her hair set at the venue. But still, it was too early. I couldn't help but suspect she was here to mock us. Hey, isn't my dress cute? I might even be mistaken for the bride. I didn't want any unpleasantness on this special day. I forced a dry laugh. Soon it was time for my makeup to begin. Ushered by the staff, Sarah left the dressing room. I sat down in front of a large mirror, relieved. But I couldn't see Evan anywhere during the makeup. He must have been nervous and walking around in the lobby, so I went to look for him after finishing. Since it wasn't time for the guests to arrive, only the staff were in the lobby. So then, the garden, the restroom. As I pondered and walked down the hall, I stopped in front of the relatives' room. The bride and groom's room is a bright and all-white space. It's luxurious, with a bed and a bathroom even, in the back of the makeup room. We aren't gonna stay overnight. When would we even use this? Evan and I had laughed about it. On the other hand, the relative's room had a more subdued brown palette. I became curious about that relative's room and quietly opened the door. First, I saw the counter where drinks for hospitality would soon be arranged. It was a two-room suite with comfy sofas lined up in the room beyond. Evan had said during our venue tour, I liked the relative's room better than the bride and groom's. You can totally crash on those big sofas. As expected, there was a noise coming from the back. But something was off. It sounded like the faint meowing of a cat. And the sofa was creaking unnaturally. My heart was pounding as if it would break. From beyond the thin wall, I heard Sarah's voice. Such a bad husband, doing this on your wedding day. I didn't need to see to understand what nasty things Sarah was up to from the sounds alone. But the others should be someone I don't know. I hoped, but this is the best way to relax before the big moment, isn't it? That was unmistakably Evan's voice. I collapsed on the spot, limp. In a daze, I peeked into the next room. No mistake about it. Evan and Sarah were entwined naked. Evan, burying his face in Sarah's chest, cooed for one more time. Are you sure we have time? Is the groom supposed to be doing this? It's fine. My prep will take just 10 minutes. Man, I'm so over this. Emily's show-off happy wedding. That's terrible. The star of the show's saying that. I'm not the star. It's funny, though. Emily doesn't look the part of the star either, does she? No matter how much she dresses up, a plain Jane is just a plain Jane. She's just making a spectacle of herself. Was I the only one excited about the wedding? Suddenly, my heart went quiet. Once I calmed down, hatred bubbled up within me for the two of them, entangled with not a stitch on. Sarah suited this scandalous look far more than any white dress. They had spent all this time mocking me. I'd make them the main event of today. After a while, when I stepped out of the dressing room, my mother, with a pale face, rushed over. I will never forgive this. When I said this firmly, my mother nodded solidly. 20 minutes later. Why? Evan is trying to forcefully open the door to the family waiting room. But it shouldn't open. I borrowed the key from my mother and locked him in. I even rigged a door jamb. Hey, is anybody there? It won't open. Evan is banging on the door, calling for help. He's blissfully unaware of what's happening outside. What are you doing there? I asked. Emily, is that you? The door won't open. Can you open it from the outside? Do you want me to open it? Of course I do. Hurry up. He seems a bit irritated. I unlocked the door from the outside for him. As soon as Evan came out of the dressing room, he grabbed my shoulder. Why didn't you open it right away? Evan stopped his motion abruptly. And no wonder. Behind me were all my relatives, Evan's relatives, and even the wedding venue staff. What's the matter? Sarah, popping her head out, seemed to have sensed the tense atmosphere. She tried to pass it off with a thin smile. What's going on, everyone? I was just taking a little tour of the wedding venue, and it seems I got locked in. I was really in a bind. She started making excuses without anyone asking. Evan's relatives opened their mouths with a look of dissatisfaction. We received a call from the venue informing us that something serious had occurred and to come quickly. Is it true that Evan and Sarah were locked in? What a foolish prank. We hurried over here for this nonsense? The other relatives expressed concern, asking if Sarah was okay. To the relatives gathered without an explanation, it seemed as though I was making a big deal out of nothing. That's when I revealed the truth. The truth is, just a moment ago, Evan and Sarah were cheating in this room. What? Evan, Sarah, and the relatives all had their eyes wide open. Evan first tried to grab me by the collar, but then, seemingly aware of the people around, he awkwardly put his arm around my shoulder. What are you talking about? You must be mistaken. Were you dreaming or something? His mouth was smiling, but his eyes were urging me to be quiet. It was like being stared down by a snake, and it was frightening, but I remained expressionless. It's not a mistake. I saw it. That's why I locked the two of them in this room. Emily, don't lie. Evan's forced smile was strained. Seeing this, Sarah tried to defend him. Emily, please stop this. Look, everyone. Emily gets really jealous. She's upset because Evan and I are close. One time I was kindly helping with the wedding preparations, and she sent me away. She's just a cousin, but it's strange to be jealous, right? Essentially, she just dislikes cute little me. But to tell such a lie, that's the worst. Unlike Evan, Sarah's calm explanation had the relatives nodding. They began whispering to each other while looking in my direction. They're probably talking badly about me. Evan's parents tried to calm the situation, but no one was willing to listen. A groom cheating at the wedding venue on the day of the wedding is not something you normally hear of. Therefore, it was more believable that it was a bride's ugly jealousy leading to slander. Evan's relatives glared at me like needles. Evan, who had been nervous, gained confidence. Look, Emily, apologize to everyone for causing trouble with your lies. And then my mom stepped forward and apologized. I apologize for calling you all here earlier than scheduled. I stood beside my mother, but I'm not going to apologize as Evan wants. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on our special day. As a small token of our apology for the rush, we have prepared a special entertainment for you. With a cue, the staff began guiding all the relatives to the banquet hall. Evan and Sarah followed behind. The relatives, confused. In the hall, a giant screen was lowered. Please take a look. In the dimly lit hall, a sultry voice suddenly filled the air. At the same moment, the intimate scenes of Evan and Sarah were projected on the giant screen. Screams erupted from all around. Sarah stood in front of the screen, yelling, "Stop it! Turn it off!" The scandalous affair was exposed for only a few seconds, but it made for the most exciting entertainment. Now, I wonder who's lying. I asked in the silent hall, "Sarah, do you intend to be the bride in that pure white dress? If you're saying that it's not my day to be the center of attention, then surely it must be yours, right?" I looked around and saw that everyone was watching. The stars today are you, Sarah, and Evan. I started clapping, but the crowd remained frozen. Evan, with his face red as a beet, grabbed my collar without hesitation. "You! Don't mess with me. The one messing around is Evan." I snapped back and his grip loosened, as expected from a cute girl's sidekick. He can't stand up to the strong. Such a weak guy. I took a breath and asked gently, "Let me ask you again. What were you and Sarah doing in the dressing room?" Evan clenched his teeth. This secret filming. Why? Of course there wasn't a hidden camera at the venue. The answer is simple. I just filmed the dressing room with my smartphone. Duh. And I sent it to my mom. My mom shook her smartphone to show it. If I confronted them alone about the affair, I'd likely be fooled by the bold Sarah. So I secretly filmed their little rendezvous and sent it to my mom right away. My mom was quick to act. Having worked at the venue for many years, she had moved up from planner to manager, and she was adept at coordinating the staff. She swiftly gave directions to lock down Evan and his group, gather the relatives, and even started preparing the video and screen. Neither my mom nor I wanted to make the video public. This was a last resort in case Evan and the others refused to admit their guilt. "You think you can film us secretly, expose us, and get away with it for free?" Evan said, his eyes brimming with tears, trying to bluff his way out. Then his mother slapped his cheek. "Stop this nonsense." I had actually sent the video to his parents as well. They probably never imagined they'd be shown their son's true colors on his big day as he was about to leave the nest. I thought they might defend Evan, but instead they said, "Let's gather the family and confront them in front of everyone." That was our cue to take action. Evan and Sarah are relatives. Because they are family, his in-laws wanted to avoid ambiguity and made a tough decision. "My mom betrayed me." Evan staggered back fearfully, clutching his chest as if he was about to hyperventilate. "You're the one who betrayed us, Evan." His mother yelled, tears streaming down her face. Evan's cries were loud and grating. Everyone frowned and looked down on him from afar. In the midst of this, the other main character, Sarah, was trying to sneak away from the crowd. Even amidst the commotion, she stood out too much in her pure white outfit. A middle-aged relative nearby caught her right away. "Let me go, don't touch me," Sarah protested, looking down. The middle-aged man raised his voice in desperation. "It's a lie that you were cheating with Evan, right? You love me, don't you?" Then another man, grasping the situation, shouted, "You were messing around with someone else besides me?" Sarah, head still bowed, gave no reply. It seems Sarah wasn't just involved with Evan. It's unbelievable that she was involved with 3 relatives all so close to her. Evan stopped crying and yelled at the men. "I'm special. I gave her $1,500 every month." Sarah's head spun and she collapsed. Evan had just spilled the beans on something he shouldn't have. Following that, the other 2 men also confessed to giving Sarah money. In the end, it was all about the money for Sarah. The men who had been rivals for Sarah's affection suddenly teamed up. "You said you only loved me, but you lied." Now Sarah's enemies were Evan and the others. Surrounded by the encroaching men, Sarah trembled violently. "Help me!" Then unbelievably, Sarah's eyes met mine. With everyone in the family looking at her with disgust, it seemed she couldn't even rely on her own parents in such a situation. She probably couldn't even bear to look her parents in the face. The attention-seeking Sarah, "Everyone's looking at you now. Aren't you pleased?" Sarah's face turned pale, and she rolled her eyes back, losing consciousness. Evan grabbed her arm and yelled, "Hey, Sarah, we're not done talking." "You cheater." I tapped Evan on the shoulder from behind. "You're not done talking to me, Mr. Cheater," I said with a sneer. Could this be a skit of some sort, I wondered? Evan is completely oblivious to the mess he's in. The color drained from his face as the reality of his situation hit him. No, you've got it all wrong. It's not cheating. I don't love Sarah. It's you, Emily, that I love. It's like I was just visiting a professional, you know? I was just paying Sarah, that's all. I put on my best smile and nodded, playing along. Evan, slightly relieved, began to relax his guard. "Right? You were buying Sarah's time with my money." He looked up to the sky, still smiling faintly. When he mentioned transferring $1,500 to Sarah each month, it clicked. That was exactly the amount I had been giving him for our wedding savings. How could I forgive him for funneling our future happiness into his selfish desires? "Please forgive me." Evan looked at me with tearful eyes. Pulsive. I had the urge to stomp on his head, but restrained myself. I didn't want to get my shoes dirty. In the end, we called off the wedding. Thankfully, we had mostly just invited relatives, so after the debacle, we sent them home. Breaking off the engagement with Evan was, of course, the only option. Thankfully, it was before we had legally tied the knot. About this, even though I wanted nothing more to do with Evan, he came to me holding something. "We still have to pay for the wedding, even though it's canceled. This is like highway robbery. Can you talk to your mother about it?" He presented a bill for around $40,000. Of course, we were liable for the full amount, as it was the day of the wedding. We could just pay it from our joint savings, I offered generously. But that was mostly relatives' money, right? We were going to come out ahead with the gifts. I didn't think we needed any savings. "So you spent it on Sarah," I finished for him. To Sarah, Evan was normally not someone she would consider dating, but with the wedding looming, she must have felt a sense of loss. It turned out she had seduced him. "Are you sure you want to marry such a plain Jane? Looks like you're set for a dull life. If you had money, at least you could have some fun with cute girls like me," she had teased him. That's what got him to hand over that $1,500 he had on him. After that, their transactional relationship continued, both financially and physically. "It's your fault the wedding was ruined, so you should pay this." I was about to retort angrily, but suddenly Evan was out of sight. He had been floored by his father. Apparently my in-laws had been suspicious of Evan and had followed him. "It was you who broke it." His mother yelled what I had been feeling. My parents apologized profusely to me. Evan was dragged back home by my father-in-law. Later on, through a lawyer, I demanded compensation from both Evan and Sarah. The adorable Sana was apparently the idol of her relatives. Her parents doted on her as well. Even if their beloved daughter messed up, as long as money could solve the problem, her parents might have covered for her. But even they ran out of patience after the horrendous spectacle she displayed on the wedding day. Both of them had no savings, and they ended up borrowing money to pay me the compensation, as my in-laws informed me. Furthermore, both were kicked out of their parental homes. Evan, with no experience living alone, became stale and started to imagine everyone at work hated him, which led to his resignation, according to a mutual friend. And Sarah, hopping from friend's house to friend's house, was ostracized wherever she went for bad-mouthing me. Soon enough, she'd run out of places to go. Now that Evan and I were no longer engaged, they could be together openly, yet all they did was blame each other. They were suffering because of their own actions, not someone else's. Some time has passed since the incident, and I've been enjoying peaceful days. My life's over, I sighed, still saddened by the shattered dream of my perfect wedding. What are you talking about? My mom hit me on the back, snapping me out of it. In your 30s? You're still young. Life's not over if you just mope around at home. But outside, there's a whole lot of new happiness waiting for you. Where could it be? Let me think. The peak of Mount Everest? Or perhaps the Sahara Desert? That's way too far. What? Come on, let's go together. My mom and I couldn't help but laugh. She's right. Happiness must be out there somewhere. For starters, she's suggesting we go to the spa this weekend. Maybe she just wanted to take a trip with me? No matter where you go, no matter what mistakes you make, you always have a home to return to, Emily. She muttered softly and began to prepare for our spa trip right away. Always strong, always dependable. That's my mom. I realized I'm still protected by her. I haven't given up on the dream of marriage yet. I'll build a bright home and become a mom just like her.